Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. And this is a show called Insight. Now, this is a show where we discuss books on politics, both domestic and international issues, sometimes historical books that provide a perspective on the present, and sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books that put sort of political developments or issues into a broader perspective. Today's book is sort of a series of vignettes, you might say, on looking at the United States. The author, Sarah Kendzior, is a St. Louis resident, and the title of her book is called The View from Flyover Country, Dispatches from the Forgotten America. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Cameron Jones. To Cameron's right is Sierra Brown. And to Sierra's right is Anna Reynolds. So I wanted to read an opening quote from the book, give you a sense of where she's coming from, and then we'll jump into a discussion about it. So the author writes, "It is easy when people feel frightened and abandoned for a demagogue to exploit feelings of despair for political gain. It is easy for that demagogue to translate fear into fanaticism, to shift extremism into the mainstream and market it under the guise of populism. By the time buyer's remorse hits, a new and more brutal political culture has arisen. A gaslit nation becomes engulfed in flames. I had predicted nearly all developments of the 2016 election and Trump's win. My foresight was an unfortunate byproduct of a lifetime spent studying foreign demagogues, along with an intimate understanding of deteriorating political conditions in the United States."
All right, so that goes into some of the main themes of the book, which is that there are many in the United States who are unsure of their futures and their economic stability, and they're afraid of what's going to happen to them. A lot of people are worried about getting a decent job, about, well, just being able to hold on to that job, really, even years now after the Great Recession has ended. When you consider that, you can kind of see why there would be some people that would be attracted to a politician coming around saying that he's going to make America great again and restore their stability.
And also building off of that, there's key issues she looks at: labor exploitation, racism, gentrification, and other post-media economic economy, and also looking at how the media plays into that. And because she focuses on a lot of the Midwest, because she is a St. Louis resident, you also see that how she looks at the Trump campaign towards the end of the book, and also how he campaigned for the average American who had been forgotten. And in St. Louis, the average American has been forgotten, but his campaign was towards the revenge of that and trying to avenge them. So actions speak louder than words.
What you mentioned about the racial tensions, the educational disparities, and the socioeconomic inequities is absolutely what Kendzior takes into her vignettes. What she examines is not just the effects of Trump's presidency and why we're here. She examines the how of the culmination of these events, and the idea that the 2016 election was not just a singular event. It was a culmination of many smaller events that led people to become frustrated and ultimately, as Cameron mentioned, decide that they were fed up with racial inequality and socioeconomic disparity and elect Trump, as Kendzior mentioned.
There's a quote towards the beginning of the book, and I think it sort of weaves itself through the book. She writes, "Pundits have been proclaiming there are two Americas, red and blue. This has never truly been the case. There are dozens of red Americas with extreme variations in demographics and values, and dozens of blue Americas as well. There are endless variations of America in St. Louis alone. Again, she sort of weaves St. Louis through it just because she lives here.
Well, but it's definitely true in that everyone has their own personal idea of what America is like. You could say there is a red and blue America, but there's also white and black America. There's various Americas for different religions. Even people from different states in different settings, like urban or rural, they're going to have very different ideas of what America is like.
And also, going off of that, she has said there is a red America and a blue America, and how this is divided. We can also see that, like Cameron said, there is a large number of people who might identify with one, and you could see that throughout the United States. But also, you have to also consider that this is just one person's opinion. There could also be, various other types of America.
I get a sense from reading her book when she's obviously not excited about Donald Trump being president, and that's fine, it's her writing, but she's sort of looking at it as it's sort of like he's almost representing people that are mad and want everything burned down, but they don't know what they want to make something better. And she's sort of reflecting through the book, here's some bad things, but then there doesn't appear to be, okay, so how are you planning to approach it? What are you planning to do about it? It isn't sort of, I think if and whenever the Trump presidency ends, you're going to probably see comparisons between him and the Reagan presidency, where you can say, okay, both of them might be forms of conservative thinking, but Reagan had a way of trying to make people feel positive about, okay, what are we going to do about the problem? Whereas Trump is just reflecting, we're mad, so we're willing to take away and destroy, but we don't know what we want to make it better. And she sort of almost has that sort of approach as you go through the book. There's other quote she had. It's interesting. She said, a child born in Egypt, Iran, or Iraq will live longer than a child born in North St. Louis. Sort of just one of her ways of sort of looking upon how she looks at some deteriorating conditions in some places within American cities.
And Kendzior takes this view of, she is a St. Louis native, as you mentioned earlier, that she has people come to her and say, well, St. Louis is one of those cities. And she really does not appreciate that narrative, that it's one of those cities, it's just a bad city. And one of the things that what people probably don't realize about St. Louis if you don't live there is that St. Louis is largely portrayed through the media only through certain neighborhoods. And so what you see because of that is only the most socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods. And as a result of that, you see higher crime, and that higher crime is made to look to be attributed toward ethnic minorities. Because of this, St. Louis has gotten a very poor reputation. And this happens in many urban cities, and the author does use St. Louis because she is a St. Louis native. But it's a form of gentrification, and the author is trying to erase poverty blaming through her narrative that St. Louis is not just one of those cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she had one chapter, it was sort of talking about New York City and how expensive it is to live there. And I understood, because having lived in New York and grew up there, that I think she's mainly talking about Manhattan. You're going to still find it expensive in the other boroughs, but again, that's not all New York City. So Manhattan is still different than Queens or the Bronx or Brooklyn or Staten Island, and so I guess that part when I read, I was thinking, well, she looks like it's somebody who doesn't understand New York well. And yeah, Manhattan could be nuts in price to live there. But she's got to sort of separate some of this stuff out, because she's saying, you have these various degrees of blues and reds. So to go through this process.
And going back on what you said about New York, she does bring up this whole idea about how creativity is dying, and one of the reasons why she's saying that people need to get out of New York, and a New York native she had interviewed said that young people need to get out of New York, is because the whole aspect of creativity is dying. But they've come up with this service where they have artists come in and create come into areas where you have doctors and lawyers and such, and they almost influence their children in order to get that creativity aspiration going within the child, so that these artists have jobs and also these children are benefiting from that.
That was strange. I read that and I had to go out and look it up. That you have very wealthy people hiring artists and musicians to babysit their kids, to come in and be artists and musicians in front of their kids being babysat, to somehow inspire them. So I think the point she was trying to get across there was that it isn't like it's art and sort of creativity across the wide spectrum of people's incomes, that we're limiting it to a very few, so what happens to everybody else? So yeah, so there's some observations she's trying to make about how there's almost a removal from the rest of people.
But also building off of that, she also throughout the book talks about, towards the middle of the book, how your degree, it should not be catered to the job market. It's our economy that has changed what our degree is worth. And she goes into talking about an adjunct professor who only made about annually $10,000 a year, and how our economy is broken and that we shouldn't have to change our major for that. We should be continuing to study things like humanities and art and stuff like that in order to help rebuild a broken economy.
The reference to somebody teaching and living in poverty, I saw that weave through the book in a few places. So she's talking about adjunct faculty teaching at universities. So they're really not full-time employees. They're just being paid for teaching a course or two. And then she's finding a number of them that live in poverty. And you're having, which has been going on, it's not really new. I know I've read this for several decades, that you have at certain universities, a high percentage of the courses are being taught by adjuncts, people who are coming in to teach one course or two courses and then go. And that's, I guess she should have reflected on that more in a historical way to realize it's been going on at schools for at least in some cases the last 20 or 30 years. But it creates a problem where then I'm trying to figure out what are these people doing. You know, if they have a full-time job and then they come in to teach one, okay, supplemental income. But she made it look like some of these people, that's their whole income, and as a result, they're in total state of poverty.
The author connected the adjunct professor in a sense to the unpaid internship in a way that you are supposed to be grateful for the prestige that it comes with, rather than expecting a salary. But unfortunately, prestige does not pay medical bills, prestige does not pay your utilities, and prestige does not put food on the table. And so when we live in a society where you're supposed to be grateful for not having food in your mouth, you're putting a great deal of people at a disadvantage. And as a college student, I am expected to have an unpaid internship at some point in my career, and so it's expected that I am going to be socioeconomically privileged enough to be in a position to take that unpaid internship and still have enough money to go on and have the necessities that I would otherwise need, whether that money comes from my parents or from working an outside job in addition to this unpaid internship. And so Kendzior uses the example of an adjunct professor in relation to the unpaid internship. She kind of parallels the two to show the privilege in the education system, which is just terribly unfortunate because we need education in this country.
Yeah, she kind of likens it, well, she does liken it to the unpaid internship in that In some cases, it's necessary that you teach as an adjunct before you're able to go on to be a full-time professor, and it sort of blocks off some of the more lucrative careers in education and in universities to people that have the money to survive through their period as an adjunct, on that small income, like you said.
Yeah, the image, though, people will sometimes always have that. From an adjunct, maybe then they're going to open the door and I'll get a full-time job there. That's one of those illusions that a lot of times, and most of the times, it's never going to happen. You're going to stay an adjunct forever, and you hold out the hope on those few that went from being an adjunct to full-time status. And so, unfortunately, they stay adjunct. But people are under that impression, oh no, I'm going to do it and the doors are going to open. No, ain't happening. She had an interesting quote here again on St. Louis. She said, to exceed, one is supposed to leave a city like St. Louis, a middle American city associated with poverty and crime. Again, I'm thinking, all right, well, she could say it, I'm thinking, really? No. Again, it's sort of what parts of St. Louis are you looking at, and so too big a generalization there, I guess.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it goes into kind of another thing she had said earlier on, along the lines of St. Louis only ever makes it into international news whenever there's a tragedy. So.
And she used the Ferguson case as an example, and also this kind of looks at how the media plays into trying to almost make, if you live in St. Louis, you know that some of the stuff that she's saying is true, because St. Louis is a great city, but also this is something that you could look at maybe, in Houston. You really only hear anything bad going on when you hear about a shooting, but if you've lived in Houston, you know that around that area it's a beautiful city.
She had an interesting thing about Philadelphia, how you end up having trains going through the city, and so to look out the window and see poverty, because 28% of the city is living below the poverty line, which is a very significant number to think, wow, you're talking about more than a quarter of the population are living below the poverty line, but somehow people in trains shouldn't see the poverty, so they're going to paint the sides of the buildings to put nice murals on them, so that you see the murals rather than the blight. And I was reading that and I was thinking, they did that, I think, in the Bronx. And I'm going back about 30 years ago, and they did the same thing. That trains going through shouldn't see poverty in Bronx and part of New York City. What they should see is nice paintings on the sides of buildings. So sort of seeing that, it was an interesting reflection on how you're trying, and I maybe not address a poverty issue, but cover it up.
Yeah. It kind of goes into her whole point about gentrification and how it's mostly just like improving the look of something, but not actually fixing the problem of it.
And the issue with gentrification is it makes it so easy to ignore an issue, where when you live in a state of privilege, it's easy to ignore a racial injustice or a socioeconomic inequity. It's so easy to just sit there and pretend it's not a problem, especially if you're going to paint over everything that looks bad or that's an eyesore. But by ignoring the problem, you're complicit in the problem, and that's where your privilege really begins to show.
Her concern, it seems to be, about gentrification is there's a problem with the people living there, so that instead of somehow helping them or helping them improve, we have to bring others in to the area. So she doesn't like that idea of thinking, oh, we're going to import people to end gentrification because the people that are there are the problem.
Yeah, and she goes into that when she talks about taxi service companies like Uber, Lyft, and such, where they bring people in and she called them innovative hipsters that try to pass off for innovators. There's certain areas where taxi cab services will go and they're dangerous, whereas that if you were a Lyft and Uber driver, you don't have to, because you're basically on your own schedule. So those are, areas where you're going to find people it starts to go backwards instead of forwards. People are trying to find jobs because they use taxi services to get to and from work, or they use public transportation, and they can't do that if we start going into companies such as Uber and Lyft, especially in certain areas.
She had a good chapter, I thought, on the decline of malls in America, and she was sort of looking at it from a different point of view, which wasn't that online internet buying is necessarily the culprit that's killing malls. Some of it is an increase in poverty. So she was using a term, she said between 2000 and 2011, suburban poverty surged 67%. So that she was seeing that if you're having malls primarily in suburbs, then this increase in poverty in the suburbs is where people don't have money to spend in the malls anyway, and you can't just completely blame it on buying everything through the internet. And so that I thought that was just an interesting way of putting a different twist on how you saw problems of poverty. And some of it she tries to relate to the Great Depression, which we're looking at in 2008 and 2009, even though that ends, the problems with that still continue today.
Yeah, it sort of relates back to the recession, to just general people didn't have any money to spend at the malls anymore, so that meant that you had a lot of mall workers going out of work, and the author kind of relates it back into sort of the new stories that are coming out about Amazon warehouses and how they're somewhat brutal conditions in there.
She also talks about how there's a difference between local businesses and how saying that these malls weren't really local businesses, they were more of just a way to shop, whereas that we've kind of now drawn with online shopping and stuff like that, we've gone in a different direction, whereas that if we were to use gentrification, put local businesses there, then maybe we would go in a different direction.
She then, another one thing she was looking at was what she called the jobless recovery. So while we're now seeing some of the unemployment rate come down, which is very good, she's sort of writing this just a few years after the end of the Great Recession, so that she was seeing that there was a problem with people that you would think should easily get jobs, people that have sort of a degree in computer science, or the idea of the STEM area where you're looking at science and technology and industry, engineering, that we're seeing high unemployments among these people that seem like they should be easy to get a job.
Yeah. And this goes back to the whole idea of paid internships, because their companies are taking unpaid internships, which would normally be entry-level jobs, and they're giving them to people that are just coming out of university. And if you are not able economically to take time off of work, and you're not able to go unpaid, then these jobs are just a complete hindrance in your degree plan.
Her internship example was the UN, United Nations. I thought that was cute because, who can afford to do this unless you're already living in New York City? You can't necessarily move there to take this unpaid internship, and they won't allow you to work anywhere because now you're trying to figure out, well, where you're going to get all this money from, so you got to come from a wealthy family to do it.
Yeah, and it also relates back to sort of in that case, they had to pay for the internship, which the UN denied, but it sort of goes into her whole example of internships being what she calls pay to play.
Yeah.
And it just kind of goes into another thing that she likes to we'll talk about a lot, which is that she portrays it as companies figuring out a really nice way to make a whole lot of money, which is just not pay people.
Yeah, and it also goes into her whole concept of education is a luxury, because if you are in a certain socioeconomic and you have a certain demographic in your background and you're in the lower income bracket, this is something that is never in reach unless there's those, that 10%, that opportunity that you have to take.
And she used Harvard as an example when she talked about education as a luxury, because Harvard boasts need blindness, and she argued that really they're only blind to people's needs because the university does not want to draw on their scholarship fund if they can help it. And what they argue is that they are not purposely excluding those who are lower socioeconomic status or possibly minority ethnicities. They're not purposely doing this. Rather, it's just that they're less qualified. But Kendzior then makes the point that maybe they are, but they didn't have the access to thousands of dollars worth of SAT tutors. So when you look at it, no matter how you turn the view, it all comes back to they didn't have the money. And it all comes back to money when you look at education. So it really is this luxury tax that you have to pay to play in order to succeed anywhere.
Education is a big issue because she's looking at it being closed out, but her closed out is she's only really looking at it from a couple of luxury schools. And so I know I checked and I see she got her PhD from Washington University. So you're looking at high costs related to certain schools. And realizing, well, okay, wait a minute now. I think you got to realize there's a lot of colleges and universities in this country, and how do we all fit in there? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it sort of goes back into the whole education as a luxury idea. And in this case, she's portraying it as only wealthy people are able to afford the education that would be necessary in some situations where people would escape poverty. She actually describes it as the roads out of poverty are eroding. So,
we only have a few minutes left, so give me your ideas, what you think of the book, and do you recommend that people watching the show read it?
I do. I think it's a very interesting look at some segments of the population that aren't usually looked at. I will say that personally, I thought when I looked at the title, I thought it would be a big talk on rural America, but it doesn't cover that really at all. It does cover some very good looks at a side of America that really has been forgotten.
I recommend this book as well. It does have a very unique insight into the St. Louis area, and it looks at a lot about the Central America and how it is almost a forgotten America in a sense. And it also really brings up a lot of neat and very interesting ideas that normally people don't think about.
I also recommend the book. I think it's very essential for anyone who, after the 2016 election, asked, how did we get here? Because through her series of vignettes, Kendzior assessed the how rather than simply the why or the who, which was very important as far as class and race and socioeconomic status.
Yeah, I think it's a good book. I had the impression that when I said flyover country, you'd be looking at all these different eclectic collection of communities, but it's primarily looking at central cities or main cities and some reference to a few suburban areas. But even when she looks at those, it's an interesting perspective she brings, and she's trying to show this frustration out there, and this sort of frustration is a reason why Trump gets elected. And generally why she's using the term demagogue with him is that she's trying to express this point of view that what you end up having is he wants to destroy, but he doesn't have any positive vision of what he wants to do. So we all recommend the book. Thank you for joining us today.